Clara sat at the edge of her worn kitchen table, her fingers tracing the grooves and scratches that years of use had etched into the wood. The afternoon sun slanted through the small window, highlighting the dust that hung heavy in the air. The room, once filled with warmth and laughter when her husband was alive, now echoed with silence. The only sound was the ticking of the clock above the mantel, each strike reminding her of the hours slipping away. Hours she didn't have the luxury of wasting, because time, as much as money, had run out. When her husband, Samuel, had passed unexpectedly 2 winters ago, Clara had been left with more than grief. She inherited his debts, most of them taken, in desperate attempts to keep their struggling farm afloat. Promises had been made, promises that better harvests were coming, that prosperity lay just around the corner. But the droughts came, the markets faltered, and Samuel's health gave out before relief ever arrived. Now, creditors who had once smiled and tipped their hats came knocking with stern expressions and cold demands. The farm that Samuel had poured his sweat and soul into was slipping through her fingers like sand. Every morning, Clara woke before dawn, tending to the chickens, mending fences, and the morning had begun like so many others for Clara, tending to the chickens, carrying water from the well, and forcing herself through chores despite the ache in her arms. She had learned to ignore fatigue. After all, survival did not wait for tiredness. But that day carried a heaviness she couldn't explain. The air felt thick, the sky overcast, as though warning her of the storm about to descend. Not of rain, but of reckoning. By mid-morning, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Clara stiffened. She recognized that rhythm well, steady, deliberate, belonging not to a neighbor but to a man who carried authority with every step. When she looked up from the garden rows she had been weeding, her heart sank. Mr. Hale, the town banker, sat tall in the saddle, his polished boots glinting and his hat pulled low to shield against the weak sun. Behind him, in small towns, reputations were as enduring as the mountains in the distance. People might forget a good harvest or a passing drought, but they never forgot stories, especially when they revolved around someone like Ethan McAllister. His name carried a certain weight whenever spoken in hushed tones at the general store, over fence rails, or around the church steps after Sunday service. Clara had heard of him long before she ever thought their paths might cross. Ethan owned one of the largest spreads of land west of town, a ranch that stretched farther than most folks could ride in a day. His cattle were strong, his horses well-bred, and his men loyal. Yet despite his success, he never boasted, never sought attention, and rarely mingled beyond what was necessary. He was a man who seemed to prefer the company of his livestock and the open range to the chatter of people. What struck Clara most in the stories was not the image of a wealthy rancher, but of a man scarred by loss. Years ago, Ethan had been happily married. His wife, Margaret, had been known for. The day Clara met Ethan McAllister, she hadn't expected anything other than another struggle added to the long list of troubles weighing on her shoulders. Her wagon, old and worn from years of hard use, had rattled dangerously for weeks, one wheel squealing with every turn. She had meant to tighten the bolts or replace the spokes, but with chores piling higher than she could manage, she simply prayed it would hold together until after harvest. That morning, on the road back from town with a few supplies bought on credit she could barely afford, her prayer ran out. The wheel snapped just as she crossed a shallow ditch, the wagon lurching violently to one side. Clara cried out, clutching the reins as the horse snorted and stomped, nearly bolting. With sheer effort, she brought the animal under control, but the wagon tilted too far to repair on her own. The cracked wheel lay useless in the dirt. She climbed down, brushing the dust from her skirt with trembling hands, staring at the mess. Alone on the open road, miles from home, she felt the familiar sting of helplessness press hard against her ribs. The sound of hooves approached from behind. At first, Clara's pulse quickened with unease. Travelers could be unpredictable, and a woman stranded alone was vulnerable. She straightened. The days following Clara's encounter with Ethan seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one weighed down by the same unrelenting truth. Her time was running out. The banker's warning echoed in her mind like a church bell tolling doom. Every morning, when she rose before dawn to milk the cow or gather eggs, she reminded herself she had to find a way to keep the farm. Yet as the sun sank each evening, she was no closer to a solution. The farm, though small, represented more than just soil and wood. It was Samuel's legacy, the place where he had poured his sweat, his dreams, and his heart. Clara remembered how his eyes used to light up when he spoke of expanding the fields, of one day passing the land down to their children. Children they never had the chance to raise. Letting the farm slip away felt like letting go of Samuel himself, of everything they had endured together. She had promised him, on the night he lay fading, that she would hold on to it. But what promise could outweigh the cold numbers on the banker's ledger? Clara tried to find work in town, sewing or mending, for families she knew. A few coins trickled in, but not nearly enough to dent the looming debt. When she approached neighbors, their sympathy was laced with unease. Most were barely surviving themselves, and none dared to stand against Mr. Hale, the banker, whose influence reached into every corner of the county. Clara could see it in their eyes. They wanted to help, but they feared the cost. Her pride, once a shield, had begun to feel like a prison. She told herself she would never. The afternoon Clara least expected company, Ethan McAllister rode up to her homestead. She had been bent over the garden, pulling stubborn weeds from soil that refused to yield enough to feed her, much less pay off debts. Sweat clung to her brow, her skirt was dusty at the hem, and her hands were roughened with calluses. When she looked up and saw him dismounting his horse with that deliberate, steady way of his, her first instinct was to straighten quickly and wipe her palms against her apron, as though she needed to appear less desperate than she was. "Mrs. Walker," Ethan greeted, tipping his hat. His voice was low, even, yet carried a kind of authority that made her heart give a startled thump. "Mr. McAllister," she returned politely, though surprise made her tone uneven. "What brings you? Out this way?" Ethan's gaze traveled briefly over the sagging barn, the tired fences, the patched roof of... The wedding was nothing like the one Clara had once imagined as a young girl, when she believed in white lace, music drifting across a meadow, and a future painted bright with dreams. Instead, it was quiet, almost somber, carried out in the small church on the edge of town. Only the pastor, two witnesses, Ethan, Clara, and little Lily stood in the dim light streaming through stained glass windows. Clara wore her best dress, though it was far from new, the same faded blue she had worn to Sunday service many times before. Ethan had dressed neatly but plainly, his dark jacket pressed and his boots polished. There were no flowers, no crowd, no music. The vows were spoken softly, their voices steady, but beneath the surface Clara's heart trembled. Each word bound her not only to Ethan, but also to a life she had not chosen out of love, but out of necessity. When the pastor announced them husband and wife, Clara glanced sideways at Ethan. His expression was unreadable, carved in the same calm reserve he always seemed to carry. Yet when Lily reached for Clara's hand and pressed her small fingers into hers, something inside Clara softened. The little girl's eyes shone with a hope that pierced through Clara's uncertainty, as if Lily had been waiting for this very moment, to no longer feel alone. Afterward, there was no celebration. Ethan helped Clara load her few belongings into his wagon, the weight of her meager possessions a stark reminder of how little she was bringing into this new marriage. As they rode toward his ranch, the land stretched wide around them, a sea of golden grass rippling beneath the wind. Clara sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, uncertain whether to speak. Ethan, as always, kept his eyes forward. The silence between them thick but not entirely uncomfortable. Arriving at the McAllister Ranch, Clara was struck by its size and order. The fences were mended, the barn stood tall and strong, and the cattle grazed in healthy herds. It was a far cry from her own struggling homestead, and she couldn't help but feel small in comparison. Yet Ethan didn't speak of her losses or her debts. He simply showed her the house, explained where things were kept, and introduced her properly to the ranch hands, who tipped their hats respectfully but exchanged curious glances when their eyes lingered on her. That first evening, Clara prepared supper while Ethan tended to chores outside. She moved about the kitchen awkwardly, unsure if she was overstepping or if this was expected of her now. Lily followed her everywhere, chattering in a way that eased some of the tension. The child's openness was a balm to Clara's frayed spirit. When Ethan finally came in, weary but quiet, he paused at the sight of the table set and the warm meal waiting. He gave a single nod of appreciation. No words of praise, no great gesture, just that nod. But it carried weight. Night brought its own unease. Ethan had made it clear from the start. This was a marriage of convenience, not affection, and he would not press expectations upon her. He prepared the spare room for himself, insisting she and Lily take the larger bedroom. Clara lay awake in the darkness, the wind rattling the shutters, wondering if she had stepped into a new prison, or if, perhaps, this strange arrangement might someday feel like a home. Over the following days, Clara learned the rhythm of ranch life. She rose early with Ethan, prepared breakfast, and worked alongside Lily in the garden or mended clothes while Ethan and his men rode the range. It was grueling, but it was purposeful, and slowly the ache of shame she had carried began to ease. Still, questions gnawed at her. Did Ethan see her as nothing more than a convenient solution? Would he ever open the door to his guarded heart? Or would she spend the rest of her days in the shadow of a man she barely knew, bound by vows that felt more like a contract than a covenant? Yet whenever Lily climbed into her lap, whispering, "Mama, Clara," with a smile so wide it could melt the coldest heart, Clara felt a fragile seed of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this marriage of necessity could grow into something more. In the weeks that followed the quiet wedding, Clara discovered that life on the McAllister Ranch was a world apart from the one she had known at her late husband's farm. Where her homestead had been modest, struggling, and always on the brink of collapse, Ethan's ranch was vast, orderly, and alive with activity. Men came and went each morning, saddling horses, driving cattle, and returning at dusk with dust in their hair and laughter on their lips. Clara often stood at the porch railing, watching it all unfold, struck by the sense of rhythm and purpose that pulsed through the land. Yet for all its structure, the ranch was not without its needs, and Ethan made no attempt to keep her idle. He treated Clara not as a guest, nor as a fragile woman, but as a partner expected to shoulder her share of responsibility. At first she bristled, pride prickling at the thought that she had been married out of practicality, and now must prove her worth. But soon she discovered a deep satisfaction in the work itself. She mended torn shirts for the ranch hands, cooked hearty meals that earned quiet nods of approval, and planted herbs in the small kitchen garden to season their food. Ethan, though, a man of few words, noticed. One evening, as she set a steaming loaf of bread on the table, he simply said, "You've a good hand with yeast." It was a small compliment, but from him it was weighty, and it warmed her more than she cared to admit. More than the chores, Clara found her greatest joy in Lily. The little girl's shy demeanor had blossomed quickly under Clara's care. She followed her about the house like a shadow, eager to help with any task, whether folding laundry or feeding the chickens. Lily would chatter about her pony, about the wildflowers she had found, or sometimes about her mother, Margaret, whose memory still lingered in the home. Clara listened gently, never trying to replace what had been lost, but offering a presence that was steady and kind. Each night, when Lily insisted Clara read to her by lamplight, the girl would curl up against her as though she had always belonged there. Ethan, for his part, remained steady and reserved, but Clara began to notice small shifts in him as well. He would linger a moment longer at the supper table, watching Lily giggle as Clara told her a story. He would catch Clara. For a time, Clara almost believed life was settling into something steady. The rhythm of the ranch had become familiar. Mornings filled with the clatter of hooves as the men rode out, afternoons mending clothes or tending the garden, and evenings spent with Lily by her side while Ethan's quiet presence anchored the household. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when Clara felt something more than mere necessity binding them. A glance held too long, the brush of his hand as he passed her a dish, the faintest hint of a smile when Lily begged them both for a story. But peace, she learned, was fragile. It began when Mr. Hale, the banker, returned. He rode up the drive. One afternoon, his horse gleaming and his posture smug, Clara's chest tightened the moment she saw him. Though Ethan was outside splitting fence posts, she instinctively wiped her hands on her apron and went to meet Hale at the porch. His smile was sharp as a knife. "Well, well," he drawled, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "I hear congratulations are in order. A marriage, and to Mr. McAllister no less. Clever, Mrs. Walker. Or should I say, Mrs. McAllister now?" Clara's jaw tightened. She could feel the heat in his words, the insinuation that her marriage was nothing more than a scheme to escape debt. Ethan appeared then, silent but formidable as he came to stand beside her. Hale's eyes flickered, but he continued with an oily grin. "I trust this arrangement will hold. After all, folks in town do talk. Some wonder if it's real or just a clever trick to keep me from collecting what's owed." The words cut Clara deeply, for they touched the very fear she carried. Was she truly Ethan's wife in his heart, or only in name? Ethan's voice came low and steady. "That's enough, Hale. You'll conduct your business elsewhere. My wife owes you nothing now." The way he said it, "my wife," was like a shield thrown around her. Hale's smile faltered, but he left with a warning glance, promising this. Matter wasn't finished. That evening, Clara sat at the table long after supper, her hands trembling as she folded Lily's small dress. Ethan's defense had steadied her in the moment, but his reserve afterward troubled her. He said little, retreating into the same silence that always hung around him when things cut too close. She wanted to ask him, "Did you marry me only to keep the banker at bay? Do you regret it?" But pride and fear of his answer sealed her lips. As if Hale's visit wasn't enough, nature soon tested them as well. A summer storm rolled in one night, black clouds devouring the horizon. The wind howled through the ranch, rattling the windows and tearing branches from the trees. Rain lashed the earth, and thunder cracked like a gunshot across the valley. Clara rushed to help Ethan and the ranch hands drive the cattle into shelter, her skirts heavy with mud, her hair plastered against her face. In the chaos, she saw Ethan, working with relentless determination, his voice carrying through the storm as he directed men and calmed terrified animals. Clara did her part, hauling feed, lighting lanterns, and coaxing Lily to safety inside the house before running back out to help again. Fear clawed at her chest, but so did resolve. This ranch was her home now, too, and she would not stand idle while it suffered. When at last the cattle were secured and the worst of the storm passed, exhaustion weighed on them all. Clara stood in the barn, mud streaking her hem and straw in her hair, when Ethan turned to her. For the first time, his guarded eyes softened openly. You didn't back down, he said quietly. Most would have hidden from a storm like that. Clara met his gaze, her breath unsteady. Neither did you. It was a simple exchange, yet it felt like more. A fragile thread weaving between them, built not from necessity but from shared. The storm left behind broken fences, scattered branches, and a ranch muddied with debris. But in its wake, something subtle had shifted between Clara and Ethan. Where once their conversations were brief, focused solely on chores or Lily's needs, now there were pauses where silence carried warmth rather than distance. Clara found herself catching Ethan's eyes at the supper table, and instead of looking away, he held her gaze, steady and thoughtful. Still, uncertainty clung to her heart. The banker's cruel insinuations had sown seeds of doubt. Each night when Clara lay awake, she wondered if Ethan regretted his choice. Perhaps he had offered marriage only as a solution, not as a desire. Did he feel bound to her by obligation? The same way she felt bound to keep Samuel's farm alive? It was Lily who drew them closer, unknowingly stitching the spaces between them with her innocent joy. She would tug Clara's hand to show her drawings or plead for bedtime stories until Ethan joined in, his deep voice softening as he read beside them. Clara saw how he looked at his daughter, how fiercely he loved her, and she began to understand that his silence was not indifference, but a shield forged from grief. He had lost once before. To let someone in again meant risking that same pain. One evening, after a long day of repairing storm damage, Ethan lingered on the porch while Clara folded laundry inside. The air was cool, touched with the scent of wet earth. Clara hesitated. Before stepping out to join him, the basket tucked under her arm. He glanced at her, then back to the horizon, where the last light of dusk painted the sky. "You've done more than I ever expected," he said quietly, as if the words had been waiting a long time to escape. Clara set the basket down, her breath catching. "I only did what needed to be done." He shook his head. "No, you've done more than that. You've brought life back to this place, to Lily, to me." His voice faltered on the last words, but he did not look away. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "I feared you only married me to save my land, that I was just convenient." At that, Ethan finally turned, his expression stripped of its usual reserve. "I won't lie, Clara. At first, that was the reason. I thought it practical, safe. But I didn't expect—" He broke off, his jaw tightening before he finished. Softly, "I didn't expect to care for you, yet I do. More than I thought I could again." The honesty in his voice shattered the last of Clara's doubts. She reached for his hand, calloused and strong, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate to clasp hers in return. The porch lantern flickered between them, and the silence that followed was full, not empty. From that night on, their partnership grew not just in work, but in affection. Clara found herself laughing more easily, sometimes catching Ethan watching her with a quiet admiration that sent warmth flooding through her. He, in turn, began to share fragments of his past, memories of Margaret, of the early days building the ranch, of the grief that had once hollowed him. Clara listened, not with jealousy, but with compassion. She knew grief herself, and together they carried their scars as proof of survival. The final test of their bond came weeks later when Hale returned again, determined to challenge Ethan's hold on the land through legal threats. But this time, Clara did not shrink back. She stood beside Ethan in town, her voice steady as she declared herself his wife, his partner, and rightful mistress of the McAllister Ranch. The townsfolk who had once whispered doubts saw her strength and the unity between her and Ethan. Hale, outmaneuvered and outnumbered, left in a rage he could no longer disguise. That evening, As they rode home together with Lily nestled between them on the wagon seat, Clara felt something she hadn't known in years. Peace. The land stretched wide beneath the setting sun, golden and enduring, no longer a burden she bore alone, but a future she shared. When they arrived at the ranch, Lily squeezed both their hands and whispered, "Now we're a real family." Ethan looked at Clara then,